I am Robert Pledge and a journalist, but an editor more than a reporter nowadays, though I did start as a reporter in the very early 70s, working in Africa. Africa because Africa was my center of interest. I was a student in West African languages and anthropology. And as such, developed interest in political developments in that part of the world, and ended up going to Chad, or working on this situation in Chad that nobody was really paying much attention to, this rebellion in the northern part of the country, the Tibesti area, against the central government. As I did in the early 70s. But writing quite a bit about it, getting it published in France, in England, because indeed I have a foot in both places. I was born in 1942, in the middle of World War II, of course, in London, but moved to Paris at the age of 10. My mother's French, my father English, and I see myself as belonging to the Concorde generation, in other words, this Franco-British airplane that moved very fast. It also disappeared, but that's another question. I'm around. So Africa, I was writing much about the situation in Chad and getting it published, as I indicated, but with very little reaction to a rather serious situation, until I met a friend of mine who said, you know, unless you come back with images, whether they be moving or still, nobody's going to ever pay attention to your stories. So I thought about it and figured, well, okay, I'll go back there, and this time I'll go with a photographer and a cameraman, and embarked on an amazing journey in 1970 to 1970 or 71, now I have the doubt, 1970 I believe, went to Chad via Libya. Nobody was paying much attention to Libya, where a coup had taken place, putting Muammar Gaddafi in power, overthrowing the monarchy, and went therefore with two very distinguished, I had no idea they were distinguished, but they turned out to be two very distinguished visual journalists, Raymond Depardon, who is today very well known as a filmmaker as well as a photographer, and Gilles Caron, who was one of the brightest stars in the field of photojournalism. At the airport, on the way there, we actually met an extraordinary other photographer, an icon of the profession, called Don McCullin. That was my encounter with photography and a very sort of active form of photojournalism. I later on would therefore switch from anthropology and West African languages to discovering the world and through photography, and working with photojournalists, photographers who all are today rather well established, whether it be Sebastião Salgado or Annie Leibovitz, Li Zhensheng, the famous Chinese photographer, and my friend and accomplice in the founding of Contact Press Images in 1976, David Burnett. A small group of other people would join in, Alon Reininger, Dilip Mehta, Frank Fournier, Laurie Grinker, Alexandra Vakian over the subsequent years, and Ken Jareski, of course. Very importantly, known for his images of the Gulf War, the First War. So that's how I really got into the arena of international photojournalism. My background was more academic, my interests were Africa, but today I guess Asia and China very particularly are where I go most often, including Australia and Bangladesh and other places. I came into the field that at a turning point, really, and it seems that this field encounters turning points every 5 or 10 years, but it was at the end of the big illustrated magazines, Saturday Evening Post, Look magazine, and soon Life magazine that vanished in the very early 70s, in 1970, I believe, and which disappeared in 1972, actually, and that which is the time when I started really being very active in the field. So there was that reality, these large-size illustrated magazines born out of the late 20s and early 30s because of the technological developments, printed presses, small-size cameras. All of a sudden was making room for smaller, tighter types of publications, magazines such as Time magazine and Life and Newsweek that had been around, but that all of a sudden became abundantly illustrated and illustrated more and more with color photography. So there is a double shift. The color photography becomes predominant. That's because of advertising. It's also because of the technology, easier and cheaper to print color. So there are these shifts taking place. It's also a time when television is so dominant, and therefore there is this dialogue between television and magazine, this competition. And of course the magazines and newspapers have an edge over television in the sense that they can move fast, they can publish fast. Rolls of film only take an hour and 15 minutes to process, and they can be edited and they can be on the printed page very fast. The printing technology having developed. Film was a different thing. Video was not what it became, and 16mm film was long to process and to edit and to put up on the air, much more cumbersome. It required big teams of people, less mobility. So that's a big turning point. Now, the next big turning point would be, of course, with the appearance of the laptop and the PC, the small computers, and the digital world. That suddenly transformed everything and switched everything around in the sense that all of a sudden television was able to move faster than the print journalist would be able to, and get the stories out faster. The wire services that were predominantly working black and white all of a sudden had the ability to compete with the independent photographers and the smaller agencies with color photography, which was not their specialty because they were mainly working for newspapers, and newspapers were mainly in black and white. It's with USA Today in the late 70s or early 80s that everything changed also. So all these developments, technological and others, are parallel to each other and transformed the landscape. And of course, later on, the changes would be precipitated with the small size cameras, digital cameras, mobile phones with cameras on them, and of course, 9/11 is the date when the world was totally transformed in that regard, because we entered not only the new world and the war on terror and so on and so forth, but also another reality, which is that for a week New York was cut off from the rest of the world. There were no planes leaving the city, there were no film being delivered, the Federal Express, UPS, others, postal services were dead, and yet images were moving around the world along with the words. Why? Because of digital phones and transmission and so on and so forth. So the world of journalism was dramatically transformed. It's also the time when the internet was emerging stronger than ever, and the shift took place that way. So there are these different steps, and it's very clear that today we live in a different world than the one we were living in when we started the agency. And it's the internet, stupid, it's color, it's all these different things, and a shift also in thinking the world is shrinking. The world is shrinking after the Berlin Wall. The world is smaller. There are more people populating the world. They are closer together because of the information technology. The world is tighter because of the airplanes that bring people back and forth, because the wall collapsed in 1989, because it opened up, because China transformed itself also about that period of time in the late 70s, but it really developed massively in the 80s, and 89 might have been, have slowed things down politically, but the country took off economically, and therefore the world is one big place, one big village today, instead of these different components that were competing with each other or not even interacting that much with each other. It was difficult to go to Russia, it was difficult to go to China, it was difficult, and for Russian photographers or Chinese photographers and others, it was impossible or difficult to go to the West or to other parts of the world. That changed, everything changed, and that became part of that new reality. My interest was in anthropology. Anthropology means what? The study of the humanity, of people, of mankind, etc. So that was, of course, my center of interest. I was interested in Africa. I was interested in Africa because when I was maybe 10 years old, I heard about Dr. Schweitzer, and I saw a movie devoted to him, this Midnight Dr. Schweitzer or something like this. And at the age of 10, I decided I would be a doctor, and I would go to Africa, and I would help people to get better, and to help to build a better world. I'm as Don McCullin would say, who would join the agency later on, be distributed by it, contact, I mean. I was shaped by war. I was born in World War II, and of course I heard, not until I was a little older, of course, a few years old, but the war, the consequences of the members of my family that were deported, there were prisoners of war. My father was in the Royal Air Force. We were in London and during the Blitz. I heard about the bombing of our airways, the V-1s, the V-2s, the rationing and the hardships in England after World War II. Then we moved to Paris. I was in 1951, late 51. It was the Indochina War, and a few years later would be the wars of independence in Africa and the rest of the world, and the Algerian War, and so on. So a world of conflict was part of my sort of environment and concern. And of course, the lessons of World War II needed to be thought of seriously, and I guess that is why I chose anthropology instead of medicine, and eventually got into journalism. But I think it is the same overriding preoccupation and concerns that made me opt for these different possibilities as time went by. Maybe because I was lazy, I didn't want to spend 7 years studying to become a doctor. Possibly, I don't know, didn't want to spend another 7 years doing a PhD. I wanted to be actively engaged in the world and looking at it and seeing what could, not just observing it, but seeing what indeed could be learned from it and what could maybe help to make it a better place, if one can use that formula. And I think that was, when we started Contact, that was clearly what we had in mind. And I worked with a very multinational, very diverse group of young photographers, and we went around the world to look at these things, not with the concern of covering the news, but being there where things were happening that maybe even nobody had paid much attention to. After Chad, nobody cared about. I did. Many of the projects we would work on over the years, being China and the dramatic changes that were taking place there, or the revolution in Iran, and very importantly, the AIDS epidemic, and phenomenon around the world. Those were things of great concern that we as a group at Contact, the photographers, myself, worked on very, very early. So there are moments or situations we're particularly proud of, if you will. I mean, having sensed a number of developments that were taking place around the world before most mainstream media probably did. I mean, clearly what was going on in China and the tremendous transformations that were starting to take place was something we worked on very early on. I remember distributing Li Zhensheng's work just at the time of the death of Mao Zedong, and he actually did a book called China After Mao based on this. But the AIDS crisis, well, is something that we discovered by chance through some connections. It wasn't called AIDS. Nobody actually knew what it was. Some people were speaking about a gay pest shortly after, and with Alain Weininger, who was the man behind this, we really dug deep into the topic and contributed tremendously to making it to make more people aware of.
You came of age in the generation of the late 60s in France, where there was a real social activist streak. Were you very much influenced by that in your choice of profession?
Well, I think I was, yes, influenced. I was really part of it. I mean, I was a student. I was a union leader then of that same school, and very much involved in spending most of my nights of May and June 1968 on the streets of Paris. Of course, very much shaped. It was sort of, from my perspective, was a sort of rebellion against the established order and the sort of unbearable weight sometimes of some ways of thinking and behaving, etc., and a desire, probably, but to sort of see the world open up and change itself and become more friendly in some ways. I mean, you know, late 60s, the Cold War is still on. It's the period of the decolonization, the end of it. Granted, it's new dictatorships coming to power here and there. It's also the period of the Vietnam War and all these issues, and it's also Prague and the Russian invasion, and it's, as I said, the Cultural Revolution in China, etc. All these very sort of rather tragic and oppressive and unacceptable situations that were developing around the world. So I think for me, 68 was more this sort of expressing some of these feelings and concepts more than anything else. There was also changes that were taking place in terms of interpersonal relationship, you know, the questioning the type of the generational realities and other things of this nature. So it was, it did play a very important role. There's no question. I mean, I remember at the school during the, I remember at the school organizing a number of events and inviting, in particular, a young man then who had, you know, come to speak about the situation in Biafra. It was Bernard Kouchner, who later on went to found Doctors of the World, Doctors Without Borders, and then Doctors of the World. So those were the encounters, those were the people. They didn't necessarily become all close friends by any means, but I think we were part of that same general sort of movement of wanting to make the world a better place for more people. Paris was very much the center of the world in that regard, even from a very practical point of view, because of its long traditions of course, of hospitality, asylum given to others, and at that period of time, because it was a former colonial empire, because it had lost a couple of wars that were major or had been defeated in the early parts of, and was therefore maybe more reflexive about these issues and less triumphant about them, and there was more questioning and there was more political debate, and the political debate was intense. There was a very strong Communist Party, there were strong conservative parties, there were everything in between, and there were leftist movements and rightist movements, etc. Something that you didn't find as well defined in other places. Similar phenomena were taking place from Mexico to Italy, from Germany to the United States, of course, but there was something in terms of France and Paris in particular that was sort of very compact representation of all these different realities. And certainly in terms of journalism also, I mean, there were important bureaus in Paris. Life magazine, Time had an office here. The thing is, Paris was very, in the airplane age, in the pre-internet age, was an ideal place to be because it was sort of halfway between North America and Asia, halfway between South America and Russia, close to Africa and the Middle East, much more so than the United States. It was also within Europe, halfway between London and Milan, halfway between Madrid and Berlin. A better place in Europe, a more convenient place to get to any of these places. And I think, so it's a physical, geographical reality, the fact that you can hop on airplanes, but it's also a cultural reality at that stage. Many intellectuals, artists from all over the world were in Paris and discussing things and writing and speaking and arguing and fighting intellectually about things, etc. It was a very, very lively place. Not the only one in the world, of course, because then we noticed that whether it be in Japan or South America and the United States, etc., there were similar developments. There's no question that the 60th generation was around the world was a generation in rebellion against the older order, whether it be the young Red Guards in Beijing or the hippies in America or the protesters in Mexico, and there were similar phenomena in Russia and in Eastern Europe that were developing. I went to Prague and to Budapest, not Budapest, to Prague, to Moscow, to others, Warsaw, etc. in the late 60s, and there were these movements that were already developing. It's not something that was born out of nothing. So I guess there's a time, if you're to try and sense what might happen next is something that, you know, you sort of developed out of curiosity, out of maybe your own personal experience, but I'm quite certain that studying linguistics, using the tool of linguistics is part of the whole thing, or anthropology, is to try and understand how the mind works and how the language works and how people think and speak and announce things in ways that are different than yours, but that signify something that you can start sensing. And I think for me, which is probably what medicine is also about, trying to understand how, well, journalism for me is the same thing in a way, or at least the way I see it and the way I practice it. It's a way to get closer to things and try and understand them, and hopefully it's not that you can always act on them and make the changes you'd like to see happen. And in some ways, yes, there are many changes that should have happened that haven't changed. There are many things that are not better today than they were not only 4 years ago, but 40 years ago. Other things have, and there are more opportunities and possibilities. We could do much more. We could even make it better, even though the world population has, in that same period of time, multiplied by 4. which means that the problems are gigantic. They're bigger, they're harder to resolve, and there maybe is less of the qualified leadership in political terms than there was, because people have not been formed by these rather tough environments anymore. That generation is gone. But there is also the reality that knowledge is so big to acquire. It's difficult. It's difficult to master all these things today. So conductors are becoming more, invaluable and rare in a way. I think things in many ways have not changed. The same, many of the same questions are still there. Tentative answers were put forward, but they have not really materialized always successfully everywhere. And the sense of a more just world where all would be offered similar opportunities to start their lives and to live with greater freedom and satisfaction that hasn't happened. And that world order is different people, but in many ways still very much the same, at least in certain parts of the world at certain periods of time, and the same issues are there. The only thing is that if the tools you used to try and change things didn't really work out then, the chances of them working out today might not be much better. So you have to try and think, what else is there that you can do, or how can you do it better? What are the things that you've done that might be a little helpful? That's really the change that's taken place. I mean, I'm not blasé, I'm not optimistic, I'm not totally pessimistic either. I'm not quite sure, but then I never was. I don't feel, and maybe I should have changed more, but I don't feel I've changed as much as maybe one should have in a way. I don't know. Yes, I'm not sure I was an impresario. I've always worked with people. I helped them to go further, to do more, to do better, to push, to coach them in a way more than being an impresario or an agent or etc., which of course was also part of the job description in some ways, but it's to push. And some people have changed more than others. Some have become more disillusioned or more cynical or more in doubt and more in retreat, and because the reality is that things have also become more difficult in this particular field, like in others possibly, but in this field you can't work today the same way you did 20 or 30 or 40 years ago. That has changed, and it's not that easy for people to adapt. I'm in a very privileged position in that sense that I've never carried anything, neither the old-fashioned camera nor the modern equipment. So the weight is different. It hasn't done as much damage as it might have for photographers been on airplanes and traveled the world day in, day out over 30 or 40 years, and who gets tired of it. I don't get tired of anything, really. Because things remain unfinished. And I meet young photographers all the time. I meet them elsewhere. I don't meet them as much in New York and Paris than I do maybe in Dhaka in Bangladesh or different places in China or other parts of the world with the travel. And people come up with the same questions, the same concerns. There's a similar sense of dedication. They use commitment, they use different equipment, but they've always used different equipment. The technology has changed. They're much more savvy than I am, certainly in the computer world, and they know how to use the internet. And yet, even with all these technological progress, they're still confronted to the same headaches. They're still concerned by financial matters that would allow them to pursue their work or just make a basic living. That hasn't changed all that much. And I was reading letters by older photographers prior to my generation, where the same concerns were there. Kappa and other people were concerned when they were young photographers how they were going to make a living. That's why they started Magnum, the way we started Contact. I mean, the biggest difference today is that there are more people. There are more people who, because there are just more people numbers there. You know, instead of 2 billion people on the face of this planet, there are 8 billion people, or thereabout. And then places that were cut off from the rest of the world, like China, for instance, for a long time, or other countries, well, they are there. They can move around there. Today, photographers from Africa, from South America, from all over Asia that are traveling the world. It's not only French and British and Americans anymore, which used to be 90% of the people who were covering the news. Today, no, it's not. It's many other people, and you can see it in the different conflicts in the Middle East. And you see all these Iraqi names and Syrian names and other names. They're Arabic, they're not European names anymore. You look in Asia and you see Chinese and Filipino and Japanese and Korean names. That was unheard of. I mean, it was exceptional. There were a few Asian and South American and other photographers amongst the mass of Anglo-Saxon and French journalists and photographers in the old days. It's not all male anymore. That's a major change. It's not all white anymore. That's another major change. It's people from different generations, and that is quite amazing. So that is maybe one sort of image of change and progress in that regard. But the fact that there are many more people means also there's much more information, but there's around, but it's harder to get it around in some ways, although the technology does allow it and move it fast, but it's harder to have an impact. That is one of the big concerns, and it's hard to, of course, generate revenues, because the people behind the technology are there to sell the technology. They don't really care what it's for, but that's always been the case. Most of the camera makers didn't care what the pictures were that were taken. Actually, they never really supported that much photojournalists because there were a small number of people, and most people who would use cameras would never be photographing that kind of stuff. So it's better to promote the cameras for people who are going to photograph butterflies or beautiful sceneries rather than photojournalists. That hasn't changed a bit. It's just that there are more of them too, and it's a niche market, and the big companies have a few people who take care of those people because it's a nice vitrine also for them. But their concern is the technology, improving it and selling it. It's not what the message is. They don't really care about that, or very little, even though some corporations are more concerned about human rights issues or good causes or sustainability, but that's still a minority of companies, really. It's a change that's taken place. I don't think it's a bad change. The contrary, I think more there are people concerned and interested and wanting to report things and disseminate information, the better it is. A lot of the citizen journalists are indeed very serious people and concerned people, and maybe more concerned than some of the professional journalists. And so I think it is more what the intentions are and what the behaviors are and what the message is more than anything else. There are many people, whether they are amateurs or professionals, who disseminate a lot of rubbish. So I think that's where the distinction should be made. A good citizen journalist who comes up with a really good story or analysis of a situation and reveal something about it is more important than the bad hack who's doing a lousy job and operating like a 9-to-5 bureaucrat. The thing is to get more good, intelligent, thoughtful information and reporting out there so people can get better understanding what the situation is and weigh in on their governments or whatever. I mean, it doesn't quite happen that way, but okay, and public opinion and all these kind of realities. So that is really what is important. And many people who started, I mean, were amateurs and became very serious professionals. And many professionals might have been serious professionals and they become pretty bad amateurs today. It all exists. So I think it's a qualitative issue more so than a quantitative issue. It's more what the intent is and what the results are than anything else that defines them as citizen or non-citizen journalists. I mean, there's no reason to be overly optimistic either, because it is not certain whether they be citizen journalists or professional journalists. And let's say that all of those who are working are honest and serious and dedicated, etc., and meaning well. I don't know that that will be enough to make the world a better place. There are so many other ingredients that are necessary that the political body or societies in general need to cope with and deal with. But it's true that an individual journalist, an individual photographer can help to make changes even in a very constrained environment. I'm thinking of Lu Guang, this Chinese photographer, who's done a tremendous amount of work on the issue of pollution and coal mining in China and the devastating impact it's had on the health of people locally and beyond, and the pollution of rivers, etc. And been very critical in a way of behaviors, not only that of the provincial governments or maybe even the central government in China, but also of the corporations, North American and European and Japanese, etc., who contribute together with sometimes corrupt local politicians in China to pollute the world. I mean, we've taken our pollution out of our backyards to put it in China and other places in the world. So I think Lu Guang deserves a lot of credit for dealing with this, been working on this for 10 years. And there are other photographers around the world who are doing amazing work in that regard, photographers and word journalists and people who are involved in video and television work, therefore, and film, multimedia forms of all kinds, etc. It's astounding the amount of remarkable work and investigation and reporting that is done. And that's why I'm a little pessimistic. On the other hand, is that there is all that good stuff. There is all that knowledge out there that's accessible. It's accessible one way or the other. You can get hold of it through the internet, thousands of ways. Even in China, even anywhere in the world, you can get it if you really want to. And yet, many of these issues are not dealt with, or not dealt with in a positive way and changed. On the other hand, we're not exactly going into darker ages either completely. I mean, there are lots of things that are very concerning. What's happening in Ukraine today is of concern, of course, or what's happening in the Middle East, and with this new organization born out of nothing we knew of a few years ago, ISIS, and so on and so forth. But that, I think, denotes the shortcomings of the political leadership in those places that are allowing this to happen, and in our countries where this was not really taken into account very seriously. Now, it's possible that there were some scholars and academics and researchers and who knew that this might happen, could come about, but that information was not out there clearly that we were fully aware of. And I think it's been true with all these pollution when we're speaking of progress and developing the world and making a better place, developing the automobile industry. Of course, it was very encouraging, but never did any of the people, like the tobacco companies, they never told people that no, it could induce cancer, it could kill people, it could do these things. Because we're in societies that are in for the hard sell and for the bucks, and and that's what it's about, and not being honest in that regard. And there's a general form of sort of insidious corruption in that regard, where nobody wants to speak about it. The politicians rely on corporations to finance their campaigns, so they're not going to say bad things. So yes, you need activists, you need rebels, because they're the ones who bring it up. And then I remember when the Green movement started, and I met Cohn-Bendit when he was a young man during the May events in 1968. Most people were laughing at the whole concept. Today, it's a very mainstream concept, because there is greater awareness. So it means that the activists on the one hand, the journalists on the other, have done a great progress to make these issues totally acceptable, etc. And yet, some of these things that are happening shouldn't happen just based on this knowledge we know, etc., and could be avoided very easily. So there are these continuous discrepancies. New generations come in who don't have the same knowledge or have more knowledge, but the older generation doesn't want to do anything about it. All these combinations exist and make it very difficult. But that's what I guess life is about, and society and people are about. It's complex. So yes, you can try and persuade people with sledgehammers, or you try and do it some other way. And I think soft power, sort of, and maybe that's what journalism is about or wants to be more than anything else. Otherwise, the alternative is to either get engaged in political life or start a revolutionary movement of some kind. I mean, these are different degrees of similar phenomenon. Actually, the OPC is a little older than I am. It was born in 1939, 3 years before I was. So we grew up together, sort of, or in parallel. It's not that I knew of their existence until much later. It's only in 1973 that I really heard about the OPC for the first time, when David Burnett, together with Raymond Depardon and Chas Gerritsen, on a situation that developed in Chile on September 11, 1973. Chile that I had been working in and I'd followed in the years prior to that. So I felt very much part of this recognition in a way that, so when David Burnett and Depardon and Gerritsen won the Robert Capa Gold Medal, which is given out on an annual basis by the Overseas Press Club of America. That's how I heard about it for the first time, and I had met John Morris by then. I knew him a little bit, and he had told me about it, and I think had been very encouraging, along with John Derniak from Time Magazine, and Time Magazine was the sponsor of the OPC's Robert Capa Gold Medal. And that's how we sort of submitted the entry, or Time might have done. I'm not quite sure how it happened exactly, but it's the Robert Capa Gold Medal that brought my attention to the existence of the Overseas Press Club of America. And of course, I followed it ever since, and every year when we had something meaningful, we would enter some of the annual contest, and often recognized. David Burnett was the recipient many times of different awards subsequently, but so were other photographers involved with Contact, and other photographers who were good friends. And from James Netchway to Eugene Richards, and people. So I knew, and it was important to get this recognition. I was also aware that the organization was not just about photography. It was about journalism in general, print journalism, television, photography, and all forms of journalism, and dealing with international topics most generally, because most of the members are foreign correspondence people. So that drew me to this organization. Not that I was particularly active. I sat on several juries for them, and I promoted them the best way I could and followed what they did, and became a member much later on, and developed a great respect for what the Overseas Press Club was trying to do, trying to achieve, and has in many ways achieved. I have attended many of the annual dinners, which is one of the rare opportunities where many people get together, and it has given me the opportunity to meet people in totally different fields of journalism than mine. I mean, Peter Jennings and NBC, Tom Barkow, or people from the print media, from newspapers and publications that are very well established, maybe locally or regionally, throughout the United States or the rest of the world, correspond. And I think it's quite a remarkable organization because of that, and that allows us to not feel isolated, to know that there are other people who are there in different fields of journalism, that it's not just about what we do in our field, but it's something much broader than that. And it's a very, I think, very important institution in a way. Now that it's 75 years or plus of age, it is a very important institution. And not because it's old, but because it has much to offer to future generations. And I think that is what's important. It's not just to be recognized for what all it's done, but because of all it's done, it offers the possibility of thinking that more can be done in years ahead.